Boston, a city celebrated as the birthplace of American liberty, a city of revolution, free speech, and moral courage. But on one day in 1835, it turned into something else. A mob hunted a man, not for a crime, not for violence, but for words. They stripped him, dragged him through the streets, and nearly lynched him for saying slavery was evil. This is not a Southern story. This happened in the North. This is the story of America's war against abolition. Welcome to Historic Crimes TV, where you get the true story of events that have happened in the past which helped shape the history of the world that we are living in. Before we begin, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. By the 1830s, slavery was not just a Southern institution, it was an American business. Northern banks financed plantations. Northern ships carried slave-grown cotton, and Northern factories turned that cotton into profit. Slavery fed the entire nation, and abolitionists threatened to destroy it. To many Americans, abolition was not morality, it was economic suicide. Abolitionists were branded as fanatics, traitors, and enemies of the Union. They were accused of encouraging slave revolts, promoting racial equality, and destroying social order. At the center of this storm stood one man, William Lloyd Garrison, publisher of The Liberator, a man who refused compromise, a man who demanded immediate emancipation, and America hated him for it. On October 21st, 1835, a peaceful meeting of the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society was scheduled. Women gathered to discuss ending slavery through moral persuasion. But outside, rumors spread like fire. Garrison is inside. They're attacking white society. They want race mixing. By noon, thousands of mobs surrounded the building. Men pounded doors. Windows rattled. Stones hit walls. Inside, women prayed. Outside, men prepared to kill. Garrison tried to escape through a back window. He never made it. The mob grabbed him. They ripped his coat, tore his shirt from his body, wrapped a rope around his waist, and dragged him barefoot through Boston streets. Crowds shouted, "Hang him! Kill the abolitionist!" This was not intimidation. This was an attempted lynching. Where were the police? Watching. Where was the mayor? Hesitating. When authorities finally intervened, they didn't arrest the mob. They arrested Garrison. He was locked in jail for his own protection. The attackers walked free. Boston had chosen its side. No rioter was punished. Newspapers blamed Garrison. They said he provoked the violence. The lesson was clear. Free speech was conditional. Anti-slavery ideas were dangerous, and violence against abolitionists was acceptable. Slavery was protected not just by laws, but by mobs. This attack was part of a national pattern. It occurred in New York City, 1834. Abolitionist homes destroyed. In Cincinnati, printing presses smashed, and also in Alton, Illinois, Elijah Lovejoy murdered for defending free speech. America was at war with abolition, and the war had already turned violent. William Lloyd Garrison did not quit. He wrote, "I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." The mob failed, but America had revealed its soul. Slavery did not survive because people were ignorant. It survived because it was defended. Defended by profit, defended by fear, defended by violence. And when words threatened chains, America answered with mobs. New York City, the financial heart of America, a city of merchants, banks, ships, and profit. In July of 1834, for 4 straight nights, New York descended into organized racial terror. Homes were burned, churches were destroyed, black families were hunted, and the crime that sparked it? Opposing slavery. By the 1830s, slavery was officially illegal in New York, but slavery still ruled the city. Southern cotton flowed into New York's ports. Banks insured slave ships. Merchants profited from plantations hundreds of miles away. New York made more money from slavery than many Southern states. Abolition threatened that entire system, and New York's elite knew it. Abolitionists began organizing lectures, distributing pamphlets, and forming societies. They called for immediate emancipation, racial equality, and an end to moral compromise. To opponents, this was not reform, it was revolution. Newspapers warned abolition would incite slave revolts, flood cities with freed black labor, destroy white economic security, and fear spread faster than truth. The violence began on July 7th. A crowd gathered after an abolitionist meeting. Someone shouted accusations. They want racial mixing. They're plotting against white workers. That was all it took. The mob moved not randomly, but with purpose. The mob did not start with speeches. They started with black people. Homes were attacked, furniture thrown into streets, families dragged out in terror. Black New Yorkers fled with nothing but their lives. Police presence was minimal and intervention was rare. The city watched. The mob burned black churches, black schools, abolitionist meeting halls. The most infamous target was St. Philip's Episcopal Church, a prominent black congregation. It was vandalized and nearly destroyed. This was not chaos. It was racial cleansing by intimidation. The mob then turned toward abolitionist leaders. Their primary target, Lewis Tappan, a wealthy merchant who had renounced slavery. His crime? Using his influence against the system that enriched him. The mob stormed his home. Furniture smashed. Windows shattered. Belongings destroyed. Only military intervention prevented his lynching. For 4 nights, violence ruled New York as authorities hesitated. Militia arrived late and arrests were rare. The message was unmistakable. Abolition would be punished, black success would be punished, and equality would be punished. When the riots ended, newspapers did not condemn the mobs. They condemned abolitionists. They claimed abolitionist extremism caused unrest and black advancement provoked violence. Victims were blamed for being attacked, and justice never came. These riots were not spontaneous. They serve a purpose: silence abolitionist speech, terrorize black communities, and protect slavery's profits. Violence succeeded where arguments failed. Fear did the work of chains. The New York anti-abolition riots revealed a truth America refused to face. Slavery did not need to exist locally to be defended violently. Where profit existed, violence followed. The Civil War was still decades away, but the war had already begun. When people ask why abolitionists became radical, why did the compromise ended, why the nation eventually burned, look here. Look at New York. Look at the mobs. He was not a radical. He was not violent. He was not an agitator in the streets. He was a printer, a minister, and a man who believed the Constitution protected free speech. For that belief, America murdered him. This is the story of Elijah Lovejoy, the first American killed for the freedom of the press. Elijah Lovejoy was a Presbyterian minister and newspaper editor. He believed slavery was a moral evil. But more than that, he believed silence was a greater sin. He wrote calmly, legally within the bounds of law. That made him more dangerous than firebrands, because his words could not be dismissed as madness. Lovejoy edited a newspaper in St. Louis, Missouri, a slave state. He criticized lynching. He questioned slavery. He defended black humanity. The response was immediate. His press was destroyed. Then destroyed again. Then destroyed again. For times and authorities did nothing. Mob violence had replaced law. Threatened with death, Lovejoy fled across the Mississippi River to Alton, Illinois, a free state. He believed he would be safe. He was wrong. Slavery's reach crossed borders. Lovejoy ordered a new printing press. Local abolitionists raised money. This press would stand. Lovejoy declared, "I have sworn eternal hostility to every form of tyranny over the mind of man." That sentence sealed his fate. On the night of November 7th, a mob surrounded the warehouse, protecting the press. They demanded it be destroyed. Inside were Lovejoy and a small group of defenders. Outside were dozens, armed and enraged. Shots were fired, then flames. Lovejoy stepped outside, not to fight, but to stop the violence. A bullet struck him. He fell. Another shot followed. Then another. Elijah Lovejoy died, defending a printing press. The mob destroyed the machine anyway. The killers were tried. They were acquitted. The court ruled the mob acted to preserve public order. Murder had become legal as long as it defended slavery. The North was shaken. Even those who disliked abolition were horrified. A young Abraham Lincoln spoke. There is no grievance that is a fit object of redress by mob law. Lovejoy's death forced Americans to choose order or liberty. Lovejoy's blood changed the movement. Moderation died with him. Abolitionists realized peaceful speech would not protect them. The nation was not debating slavery. It was defending it with violence. Elijah Lovejoy was not killed in the South. He was killed in a free state. He was not killed for rebellion. He was killed for printing words. His death revealed a terrifying truth. When injustice is protected by mobs, law becomes a lie. The Civil War did not begin in 1861. It began when America chose violence over truth, and Elijah Lovejoy paid the price. Cincinnati was called the Queen City of the West, a gateway between freedom and slavery, between North and South, between black hope and white fear. In Cincinnati, abolition did not bring debate. It brought riots, and when the mobs came, they did not ask who was an abolitionist. They attacked every black person they could find. Cincinnati sat directly across the Ohio River from Kentucky, a slave state. Enslaved people could see freedom from the opposite shore. Slave catchers crossed the river freely. Runaways passed through the city constantly. Abolitionists operated quietly but persistently. To pro-slavery forces, Cincinnati was a leak in the system, and leaks had to be sealed. By the 1820s and 1830s, Cincinnati had a growing free black population. They built businesses, churches, schools, and mutual aid societies. They owned property, and that terrified white residents. Black success challenged the lie that slavery was necessary. So resentment grew. In 1829, white mobs attacked black neighborhoods. Homes were destroyed. People are beaten, property stolen. The police did nothing. City officials blamed black residents for provoking violence. The result? Over 1,000 black Cincinnatians fled the city, many heading to Canada. This was ethnic cleansing, American style. Abolitionist James G. Birney moved his anti-slavery newspaper, The Philanthropist, to Cincinnati. His press criticized slavery calmly, but clearly. The mob response was swift. The printing press was smashed. Typists scattered into the streets. The building was destroyed. Once again, no serious arrests. Free speech was beaten into silence. In 1841, violence returned, worse than before. White mobs attacked black neighborhoods with military precision. Barricades were erected. Gunfire echoed through the streets. Black residents fought to defend their homes. The governor finally sent the militia, not to protect black citizens, but to restore order, meaning silence. Notice the pattern. The mobs claimed to hate abolitionists, but they attacked black families, black churches, black schools. Abolition was the excuse, but black existence was the target. Cincinnati's riots sent a clear message nationwide. If you oppose slavery, if you help black people, if you speak too loudly, the mob will come and the law will step aside. Many white citizens learned the lesson. They stopped speaking, stopped hosting meetings, stopped defending neighbors. Violence succeeded. Fear worked. Cincinnati proved something terrifying. You did not need slavery to defend slavery. You only needed fear and mobs willing to enforce it. Before the mob burned homes, before they murdered editors, they attacked something even more dangerous: ink, paper, and words. Across America, abolitionist printing presses were hunted down and destroyed. Because chains could not survive ideas. Abolitionists understood one truth: if slavery was exposed, it could not be defended. Pamphlets traveled faster than speeches. Newspapers crossed state lines. Words reached places mobs could not. So slavery's defenders chose a strategy: destroy the messenger. In 1835, abolitionists flooded the South with anti-slavery mail. The response? Postmasters opened federal mail, crowds seized pamphlets. Public bonfires burned abolitionist literature. The federal government did nothing. President Andrew Jackson demanded abolitionist mail be stopped. Freedom of speech was suspended to protect slavery. In southern cities, abolitionist materials were burned in public ceremonies. Charleston crowds gathered to cheer as pamphlets went up in flames. Speakers warned, abolitionist speech is treason. These were not riots. They were state-approved censorship rituals. This was not just the South. In northern cities, printing offices were smashed, typefaces thrown into rivers, and editors beaten or exiled. Respectable businessmen often led the mobs. Slavery had partners everywhere. Elijah Lovejoy's murder was not an accident. It was the end point of a national campaign. First, destroy the press, then destroy the man. America had already chosen that path. Courts often justified mob attacks by claiming abolitionists disturbed the peace. Think about that. The victims were blamed for the violence committed against them. Free speech existed only if it did not challenge slavery. Abolitionist families were not spared. Homes were attacked, women threatened, and children terrorized. The goal was not debated. It was silence through fear. Killing one abolitionist made a martyr. Destroying presses silenced thousands. That was the calculation, and it worked temporarily. America didn't just attack abolitionists. It attacked the very idea that words could be free. And when a nation burns books, it is already preparing to burn people. What if the mob didn't need to riot? What if violence could be done quietly, with paper, with procedure, and with silence? In the 1830s, the United States Congress did something unprecedented. It banned discussion of slavery. Not in the streets, not in the South, in the halls of American democracy itself. Abolitionists used one of the oldest democratic tools available: petitions. Thousands of Americans, men and women, black and white, sent Congress petitions calling for the abolition of slavery in Washington, D.C., and an end to the slave trade. These petitions were legal, constitutional, peaceful, and they terrified Congress. Southern representatives saw the danger immediately. Debate could lead to votes. Votes could lead to laws. Laws could threaten slavery. So they chose another option: silence. In 1836, the House of Representatives adopted what became known as the gag rule. Any petition related to slavery would be automatically tabled, not read, not debated, and not discussed. Slavery became untouchable. Free speech was suspended by law. One man refused to comply: former President John Quincy Adams. He was no radical abolitionist, but he believed something sacred was under attack: the right to petition. Day after day, Adams presented anti-slavery petitions anyway. He was shouted down, threatened with censure, and accused of treason. Congress tried to silence him. He would not stop. Think about what this meant. Citizens could speak, but their words would never be heard. This was not mob violence. It was legalized repression. The same goal, a cleaner method. When Congress refused to debate slavery, it sent a signal. If the government wouldn't protect speech, why should the streets? The gag rule legitimized mobs. Violence outside was reinforced by silence inside. The gag rule remained in place for 8 years. 8 years where slavery could not be questioned, victims could not be heard, and debate was forbidden. This was censorship on a national scale. In 1844, after relentless resistance, the gag rule was repealed. John Quincy Adams had won, but the cost was permanent. America had proven it would sacrifice democracy to protect slavery. When speech is outlawed, violence becomes policy. The mobs were never rogue. They were just ahead of the law. They said women should stay out of politics. They said women should be silent. They said women had no place in abolition. So when women spoke anyway, the mobs didn't debate them. They hunted them. This is the story America tried hardest to erase. Abolitionist women did something revolutionary. They spoke publicly. They organized nationally. They challenged slavery and patriarchy at the same time. White society viewed this as an attack on male authority, racial hierarchy, and social order. To opponents, abolitionist women weren't just wrong, they were dangerous. Abolitionist women faced two forms of hostility: for opposing slavery and for daring to speak as women. They were called unfeminine, immoral, sexually deviant, and homewreckers. Violence followed language. Remember Boston. The mob didn't just hunt William Lloyd Garrison. They trapped dozens of women inside the meeting hall. Men pounded on doors, threatened rape, promised blood. Women barricaded themselves inside. Police did not clear the mob. They escorted the women out, through jeering men who spat and screamed. This was intentional humiliation. The Grimke sisters were born into a wealthy, slaveholding family in South Carolina. They rejected slavery publicly. They lectured to mixed audiences, men and women together. This outraged America. Clergymen condemned them from pulpits. Newspapers attacked their morality. Mobs threatened their safety. Their crime wasn't just abolition. It was refusing silence. In 1838, abolitionists built Pennsylvania Hall in Philadelphia. It was dedicated to free speech. Women spoke there. Black and white activists spoke together. The mob responded with fire. The building burned while city officials watched. Women barely escaped with their lives. The message was unmistakable. Women would be punished for public resistance. Black abolitionist women faced the worst violence. They had no legal protection, no social shield, no public sympathy. Their homes were attacked. Their children were threatened. Their bodies are at risk. Violence against them was normalized, invisible, and unpunished. Mobs understood psychology. If you terrorize men, you frighten individuals. If you terrorize women, you frighten families. You frighten entire communities. Silence spreads faster that way. But something unexpected happened. Women did not retreat. They organized harder, spoke louder, built national networks. The violence radicalized them. America tried to scare women back into silence. Instead, it created leaders. When a nation attacks women for speaking the truth, it reveals how weak its lies truly are. You didn't need to be enslaved to be hunted. You didn't need to live in the South to be captured. If you were black, if you helped fugitives, if you spoke too loudly, America had a system to make you disappear. This was slavery's shadow army. Slave catching was not chaos. It was a business. Men were paid bounties to hunt fugitives, kidnap free black people, and drag them south into bondage. Papers could be forged. Witnesses could be ignored. Skin color was treated as evidence. Freedom was fragile. Northern states claimed moral superiority. But slave catchers operated openly. They bribed officials, used local jails, worked with sheriffs and judges. Free black people were seized in Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, and Illinois. Many were never seen again. In 1793, and again, brutally, in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Acts transformed the nation. They required citizens to assist in captures, officials to enforce slave catching, courts to deny accused people a jury. Helping a runaway became a crime. Refusing to help became a crime. Neutrality was illegal. Vigilante groups formed to enforce slavery where law hesitated. They raided black neighborhoods, attacked abolitionist homes, beat suspected helpers, and burned safe houses. They called themselves defenders of order, but they were terrorists. Children were not spared. Free black children were seized from streets, docks, and farms, sold south, and their parents searched forever. This was not accidental. Children were easier to control and easier to erase. Eventually, abolitionists resisted. They formed vigilance committees, raised legal defense funds, physically blocked captures. In some cities, rescues turned violent. Blood was spilled. America was breaking apart. Once kidnapping became law, once courts became accomplices, once mobs became enforcers, peaceful reform was no longer enough. The nation had chosen force. Force would answer back. Slavery could not survive without terror, without silence, without fear, and terror does not negotiate. It only escalates. By the time America reached the 1850s, the question was no longer if violence would come. It was how much and who would survive it. For decades, America tried to silence the problem. Burn the papers, break the presses, beat the speakers, and kidnap the victims. And when that wasn't enough, silence Congress. But suppression has a limit, and when that limit is reached, the nation explodes. Anti-abolitionist violence was supposed to preserve peace. That was the excuse, but every riot hardened abolitionists. Every burned press radicalized the movement. Every kidnapping destroyed faith in law. Compromise died first, then trust, then peace. In the 1850s, violence left the cities and entered the territories. Kansas became a battlefield. Pro-slavery mobs crossed borders. Polling stations were seized. Abolitionist towns were burned. This wasn't mob law anymore. This was a Civil War rehearsal. In 1856, Senator Charles Sumner spoke against slavery. He used words. The response? Representative Preston Brooks beat him nearly to death with a cane on the floor of the U.S. Senate. No mob, no riot. Just violence applauded across the South. The Capitol itself was no longer safe. John Brown watched decades of failed restraint. Peaceful speech crushed. Law corrupted. Mobs rewarded. He reached a conclusion many feared but few admitted. Slavery would not end without blood. Harper's Ferry was not madness. It was desperation born of terror. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected. He was not an abolitionist radical, but he opposed the expansion of slavery. That alone was enough. Southern states did not riot. They seceded as violence no longer needed mobs. It had governments. The Civil War was not a sudden collapse. It was the final stage of a long process. Years of silencing, terror, intimidation, and bloodshed. War was the outcome of failed repression. Anti-abolitionist violence was meant to save slavery. Instead, it destroyed it. It made compromise impossible. It made neutrality illegal. It forced the nation to choose, and once chosen, there was no turning back. A nation that crushes speech does not create peace. It creates explosions. America learned that lesson in blood. The Civil War didn't begin with cannons. It began with mobs. For decades, mobs ruled the streets. Slave catchers hunted the free. Printing presses were destroyed. Women were threatened. Congress silenced. All to defend a system that could not endure. And yet, despite the fear, the terror, the blood, anti-abolitionist violence failed. Here's why. Every murder, every attack, every destroyed press created heroes. Elijah Lovejoy became the symbol of free speech. William Lloyd Garrison became louder, bolder, impossible to silence. Women like the Grimke sisters inspired nationwide movements. Violence produced resistance, not compliance. Fear could intimidate the weak. It could not stop conviction. Communities formed protective networks. Vigilance committees rescued kidnapped black citizens. Free black communities created safe houses, schools, and mutual aid. White allies, sometimes risking their lives, organized resistance. Violence created infrastructure for survival, not submission. For every press destroyed, 10 more rose in its place. Pamphlets crossed borders. Newsletters circulated underground. The story of violence became the story of oppression. Ironically, attacks amplified abolitionist messages far more than words ever could. Slavery was defended by fear, but moral truth does not fear. Teachers, preachers, and activists spoke openly despite threats. Every meeting interrupted by mobs was replaced by a dozen elsewhere. Every threatened woman inspired others to organize. Violence galvanized the movement. It created momentum that law and mobs could not stop. Anti-abolitionist violence didn't just fail, it bankrupted the nation morally and politically. It radicalized the North. It hardened Southern defenses. It made compromise impossible. It ensured that when war came, it would be catastrophic. Tens of thousands would die. Millions of lives would be reshaped. All because fear had failed where reason could not. Those who thought terror would preserve slavery learned too late. Suppressing speech cannot suppress truth. Silencing women and children cannot silence justice. Burning presses cannot burn ideas. Violence can intimidate. It cannot win hearts. It cannot defeat morality. We remember the mobs, the kidnappings, the threats, not to glorify violence. We remember them to understand how fragile freedom is, to see how courage, persistence, and moral clarity defeated oppression, even when law and society sided with terror. Anti-abolitionist violence failed not because it was weak, but because truth, once spoken, cannot be chained. America's darkest mobs created its moral heroes. Its oppression created resistance. Its terror created freedom. The chains would fall. The voices would rise and history would remember. What do you think about the anti-abolition mob's activities? Should justice be reserved against the mobs? Drop your comment. I know racists will ignore it. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.